I'm very grateful for your time.
This man has attended 1,315 funerals over the past 20 years, and at each funeral, he was the only attendee. He is the loneliest person I have ever seen. No friends, no family. But he is also the type of guy we all hope exists, a guy who gives his heart and soul to those who have already died. He is a body collector, someone who handles the affairs of those who pass away alone. He tries to contact the deceased's relatives or friends to invite them to the funeral, but most of the time, he finds no one. Even when the deceased have children, they often refuse to attend due to fear of paying funeral expenses. At the end of this movie recap, you'll find yourself reflecting on the complexities of life, death, and the connections we choose to keep. One day, Mr. John May received another notification. This time, the deceased lived right across from him. The landlord said the deceased's name was Billy Stoke, and his body was discovered weeks later, only after the stench began to spread outside. Billy's room was in chaos with empty bottles scattered everywhere, hinting at a life of poverty. Mr. May found an album with photos, presumably of Billy's daughter, showing that he once had a happy family. Before leaving, Mr. May noticed a sofa propped up with a book. Perhaps Billy ended his life sitting right there. As usual, Mr. May started searching for Billy's family. But in the afternoon, his new boss called him into the office and announced that Mr. May, after working for 22 years, had been laid off.
You're letting me go? What about this morning's case?
That'll be your last one.
The new boss criticized him for being overly meticulous, which led to inefficiency and a lack of proper work methods. It turned out that Mr. May would carefully organize the belongings of the deceased, frame their photos to commemorate them, and honor their presence in the world. He also wrote eulogies based on the details left behind by the deceased and respectfully sent them on their final journey. For those with religious beliefs, he even chose higher-cost burials. The new boss was displeased, but Mr. May argued that this was the least respect they deserved. However, the new boss dismissed this, giving Mr. May 3 days to finish his last case before leaving. That night, Mr. May looked at the silent room across from him. This would be the last person he sent off. He began tirelessly asking around, showing Billy's photos, but it seemed like Billy had never existed in this neighborhood. Passing by the garbage area downstairs, he found Billy's records discarded by the landlord. He picked them up and, during his sorting process, accidentally discovered a roll of film. He developed the film and traced it to a pork processing factory. Taking a train to the factory, he finally found someone who knew Billy. The person described Billy as having a bad temper and frequently quarreling with management and union representatives, always trying to secure an extra 5-minute break for his coworkers. When his protests failed, he quit, urinating into a vat of pork before leaving. When asked to attend Billy's funeral, the man declined, saying, "We were old friends, but that was only when he was alive." Mr. May was accustomed to such responses. Fortunately, the man provided a new lead. Billy had once been with a woman who owned a fish and chips shop. Mr. May visited the shop and finally found the woman. She described Billy differently, saying he was the kind of man who could give you the world in a single day, making you want to stay with him forever. At that moment, a delivery worker came by and mentioned that once, a thug tried to harass the woman. Billy plunged the man's hand into the fryer, which landed Billy in prison. Mr. May showed the woman the photo album. She said she had never seen the people in the photos and didn't know about Billy's earlier family life. But Billy did leave her something she didn't even know about herself. It turned out that Billy had a daughter and granddaughter he had never met. Mr. May, feeling emotional, wanted to invite them to Billy's funeral, but he was once again refused. Although the woman and Billy had truly loved each other, that was a long time ago, and besides, they were not really family. Disheartened, Mr. May returned to work. His replacement had already taken over his role, treating the deceased's ashes like trash and dumping them into a container. Mr. May could only watch, powerless to intervene. Back in the office, the new boss asked about the progress of the case and once again expressed his views on the job.
And let's face it, the dead are dead. Funerals are for the living. So if there's no one there, there's no one to care, right?
The 3-day deadline had passed. It was obvious Mr. May's time was up. The supervisor was cold and indifferent, but did Mr. May's work truly lack meaning? Looking at the girl in the photographs, Mr. May suddenly got up and went outside, stopping the new boss as he was leaving for the day. He asked for permission to finish the case. The new boss reluctantly told him that he could complete it, but only on his own personal time since he was no longer an employee of the company. Mr. May then visited the prison where Billy had once been held. The warden remembered Billy, describing him as an unusual inmate. Billy had once bitten down on a belt and hung suspended for 3 minutes, all to help raise funds for a charity. Through old visitation records, Mr. May finally found a lead on Billy's daughter, Sophie. He met her at a dog shelter. Upon hearing of her father's death, Sophie was briefly emotional but quickly regained her composure. She didn't even want to know the cause of his death. It wasn't until Mr. May handed her Billy's treasured photo album, filled with pictures of her from childhood to adulthood, that Sophie's emotions finally broke through. She told Mr. May that when Billy was released from prison, she and her mother went to pick him up. By then, she no longer recognized her father, but Billy recognized her at a glance. As Billy approached, Sophie's anger erupted. Perhaps it was because he had abandoned their family, or perhaps it was because he hadn't been part of her life as she grew up. They had a fierce argument and parted on bad terms. Sophie's mother had passed away 3 years ago, and now, with her father gone, she was truly an orphan. At Sophie's home, Mr. May noticed a sofa propped up with a book, just like the one in Billy's room where he had died. Though father and daughter had lost contact long ago, their habits were eerily similar. Sophie told Mr. May that her father had been a paratrooper and had a comrade nicknamed Big Brother, who was like a brother to him through life and death situations.
They were best mates. He got in touch with me about 10 years ago.
Before leaving, Mr. May extended his usual invitation for Sophie to attend the funeral, but she still couldn't let go of her resentment toward her father's failures and declined. On the train ride back to the city, Mr. May was exhausted and drowsy. His diligent and heartfelt work had neither gained the recognition of his superiors nor moved the deceased's relatives. Instead, it had only brought him misunderstanding and prejudice. A deep, incomprehensible loneliness spread through his heart. Yet, as always, Mr. May continued tirelessly, carrying his reverence for life as he traveled far and wide. At a nursing home, he found Big Brother, who told him that Billy had been the best person in their unit. On his first day of enlistment, Big Brother had been beaten up by Billy, but on the battlefield, Billy had saved his life multiple times. Who could have imagined that not long after leaving the military, Billy became a drunken vagabond? He suffered from the aftermath of war. Alcohol could suppress nightmares, but over time, it buried more pain inside him, driving him to madness. With each visit to someone from Billy's past, Mr. May seemed to walk through different stages of Billy's life. He drank strong liquor he had never touched before, playfully mimicked Billy, hanging himself with a belt in the office, and even commissioned a tombstone for Billy. He purchased a fine coffin and carefully selected a burial plot. Before long, Sophie, Billy's daughter, reached out to Mr. May. She had finally decided to attend her father's funeral and thanked Mr. May for all he had done for Billy. Deeply encouraged, Mr. May dressed in a bright, colorful outfit and even, in a moment of mischief inspired by Billy, urinated on his boss's car tires. At the agreed meeting place, Mr. May excitedly shared all the details of the funeral with Sophie. The ceremony, the tombstone, the music, all reflecting his respect and reverence for the deceased. Sophie, touched by Mr. May's dedication, developed a fondness for the earnest and responsible man. As they parted, Sophie invited Mr. May for tea after the funeral. As the train pulled away, Mr. May watched Sophie leave, and his once lonely and monotonous life seemed to take on a new and vibrant hue. He stopped by a grocery store and carefully picked out 2 dog-themed mugs as gifts for their meeting. Perhaps too excited, Mr. May didn't look both ways or check the street carefully, as he had always done. In the final moment of his life, the perpetually furrowed-browed Mr. May left the world with a smile. His belongings lay quietly, his collection of photographs seeming as if they had just been flipped through yesterday. The traces he left behind, like his life, were simple and orderly. Mr. May's cheap coffin lay at the center of the church, with no one in attendance, just like the scenes he had witnessed countless times in his career. The hearse drove past the roads he knew best. Meanwhile, Billy's funeral was taking place, and the people Mr. May had visited filled the cemetery, forming a circle around the grave. It was the only funeral in Mr. May's career that wasn't lonely, but he couldn't attend. Mr. May was hastily buried with no eulogy written and no attendees at his funeral. His lonely life ended in silence. But then, those whom Mr. May had once helped gathered at his resting place. They remembered this unseen friend and held a quiet yet grand funeral for a man worthy of respect. A truly good person.